Hi, friends. I hope everyone's doing well. This is the last week and last video for my daily collage practice for November. I set out to explore negative space, different proportions, and having strong light and dark values. Along the way, I learned that I'm gravitating towards a muted color palette. As I mentioned in the previous video, I'm not sure if it's due to the current season, which is fall. We'll see going forward after this daily collage practice is done if I continue to use mostly muted colors. Let's talk a bit about this collage. I have mentioned that I wanted to use less shapes that I call block shapes. This dark green element is a good example of it. Sometimes I fall back into my comfort zone when collaging, and that's okay. I had a design idea I wanted to get down on paper, which included a dark block shape. The other papers will be smaller and mostly light value. I want these elements to almost blend into the blank substrate. This design style is outside my comfort zone, so that's why I wanted to try it. I typically want each element to be pronounced. I'm adding music at this point while you watch me create this simple design. I'll come back once it's finished so we can discuss it and the grayscale version. The light and dark values are strong. I want to become more comfortable with this strong contrast because I think it will elevate my art practice. Here's the grayscale version, which confirms this strong light and dark value contrast. This is another collage that I had an idea for the design beforehand, but this time I struggled to get it on paper. I decided to alter it, so this collage took longer to create because of it. This color palette will not be muted. It's one that I've used many times before. Jewel tone colors along with black, white, and gray. The design will be geometric, but as you'll see, it was a tough process getting it to where I liked it. My initial idea was to have a large pink element that had two different size cutouts. The other papers would be under this large element, partially visible through the cutouts and partially visible on the other side of the element. You're seeing me working on this purple paper to get the placement correct. Also, I didn't want one color paper in this position. I wanted the area to have two different papers. I decided to work on placing the papers under the small cutout first. Once the purple paper was glued in place, I pulled this gray and white pattern paper next. I decided on this light value paper so it would contrast with the bright pink and purple papers. After I glued the gray and white paper in place, I realized that I didn't want to continue this vertical design all the way down the substrate. I didn't think it would be interesting enough. I'm auditioning this dark burgundy paper to see if cutting it into a shape that mimics the cutout would be a better design option. I knew there wouldn't be any other papers glued underneath the pink element, so I glued it down before deciding if the dark burgundy element would fit in the cutout. I was still unsure about the dark burgundy element. Instead of taking time to decide right away, I started working on the other sections of the collage. At this point, I knew the dark element wouldn't work. It was dark enough, but the element needed a strong pattern, which the dark burgundy paper didn't have. Also, I wanted to use a pattern paper already represented in the collage. That's why I chose the black and white stripe paper. In real time, this collage took me 30 minutes to complete. By comparison, yesterday's collage took me about 13 minutes. Even though I struggled a bit with the design, I'm happy with the way it turned out, from the non-muted color palette to the geometric design. Here's the grayscale version. It shows the strong light and dark values, but it also shows an interesting design with elements in different shapes and sizes. On this day, I had a very limited time to create the collage. I decided to use some of the papers from the previous day's stash and quickly grabbed a few others. This will be a simple geometric collage. I was still being mindful of negative space, using different proportions, and having strong light and dark value elements. I don't have anything else to say at this point since it's a very simple design, so I'll add music and come back to discuss the finished collage and of course the grayscale version. Even though this collage is simple, I think it has a good design. I like how the two thin strips of the pink elements contrast in size against the three larger elements. Also, I like how they add a bit of color. I can see using this design as a starting point for a larger collage. The grayscale version confirms the strong light and dark values. I'm going back to using a muted color palette and a large uneven block shape that I've used quite a bit during this month's practice. As I mentioned in previous videos, I've started to recognize certain shapes and colors that I like to include in my collages. The focus of my style is changing and I like that. It's not to say it won't change again. Actually, I hope it does continue to change because that will mean that my art is continuing to evolve. I'm finding that starting with a large shape is a good foundation for different designs. As you have seen, I've used this shape for days 2, 16, 17, and 24, but the designs of each one are different. As you'll see soon, the design for this collage is different than the others. This is another design that I'd like to use as an inspiration for a larger collage. It has strong light and dark values with no mid-tone values. I'm starting to become more comfortable with this style, but I do think a collage is balanced if there's at least one mid-tone value element. This day was Thanksgiving in the United States, so my time was extremely limited. This collage will be very simple with minimal elements, and it was quickly made. I want to point out before I add music that the light value element took some time, but it was worth it. You'll see soon what I mean. Gluing multiple light value papers together for a long, narrow element helped to give this very simple collage an interesting detail. I'm making a note of it to use for future collages. Here's the grayscale version so you can see the values. I'm getting back on task with this next collage. I'm trying a different design with elements that I haven't used together before. That's a used tea bag paper. I used a stencil to create the black dot pattern. I also brought out more leftover geometric scraps. My plan is to use a diagonal composition for the first layer, then add geometric shapes on top. I like the two thin curved geometric shapes that I auditioned, but the diagonal layer needed to be finished first. Once that layer was glued in place, then I could go back to the geometric shape layer. I wanted the other papers for the diagonal layer to have light muted colors to match the used tea bag paper scrap. These two scraps were a good fit. All I had to do was decide on the placement, then glue them onto the substrate. Now that the diagonal layer was glued in place, I went back to the geometric layer. I had to decide on the placement of these two elements. Since these elements were thin, it was a bit tricky for me to glue them in place. Even though I glued the back of the red element, I decided to come back in with more gloss medium to make sure it was secured in place, then applied the medium to the diagonal papers as well. Now all the papers will have the same glossy look. Since there was gloss medium on the whole surface at this point, I just needed to add it to the top of the green element. After I trimmed off the excess paper from the edges, I noticed that the lower right area looked unfinished. I auditioned other geometric scraps for this area. Then I glued the dark burgundy scrap because it had a similar shape as the two existing elements. The design of this collage excites me. It's so different than any other design I've used previously. I'm going to explore it further in future collages. The grayscale version emphasizes that the first layer is the light value, except for the black dots. The second geometric layer is the dark values. There aren't any mid-tone values, but it's something that I would add when I use this collage as an inspiration for a larger one. We're on the last day of this daily collage practice. As you watch me create this last collage, which will have another geometric design, I want to talk about my experience this time around. Having a set plan was very helpful. As a reminder, my plan was to focus on exploring different proportions, having negative space, and experimenting with strong light and dark value elements. Looking back at the collages I made this month, I did accomplish having less mid-tone value elements. Some collages didn't have any. In the past, I used a lot of mid-tone values in my art. I usually had an even amount of light, mid, and dark values. I still think having at least a small amount of mid-tone value elements in each collage adds balance to the design. I don't think it's necessary, though, to have an even amount of all three values. I prefer to feature either a strong light or dark value with a small amount of its counterpart and a limited mid-tone value. I'm still working on having more negative space in my collages. It's something I don't think is necessary in all collages. As a reference, my background is in textile design, so I was trained to create art that covers the whole surface. It's a design style that I still really like. With that said, I do acknowledge that having negative space can add to a collage. I just need to figure out how to incorporate more into my art style. One thing that I'm excited to explore further is incorporating elements with different proportions in my collages. Looking back at my older collages, I see that a lot of them have elements that are close in size. Having elements that are very large with very small elements makes the collage more dynamic looking. Now that I have 30 small collages, I need to decide what to do with them. I was thinking of either gluing them onto blank cardstock or add them to a small mat. Either way, I'd like to add them to my Etsy shop. Let me know if you have a preference. Here's the final collage for this daily practice. Like the previous day's collage, this design excites me. It's one that can easily be used as a starting point for a larger collage. The grayscale version works well as is. I love how the texture on some of the papers are intensified. Thank you for taking time to watch this series of videos. If you missed any, I'll link them in the description area and in a playlist called A Collage a Day. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope to see you soon. Take care.